Dear listeners, I'm Dilek from Turkey. Today, my guest is Mr.Judah. Mr.Judah covers the Balkans for The Economist, and he is the president of the board of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. Additionally, he is the author of many books on the region. So, Judah, who has a great career, is considered an authority on the Balkan politics. The Guardian and many other media outlets describe him as a distinguished foreign correspondent. In recent years, he researched demography and depopulation in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. A series of articles has been published as a result on Balkan Insight, The Economist, and elsewhere. In line with his latest works, today we're going to talk about demographic losers in the Balkans. So let's start the interview. Dear team, welcome to Balkan Pod.
Thank you for inviting me.
I should say that I'm very excited and it's really great for me to host you here and to talk with you about the Balkans. You know, I really follow your works very closely. So thank you for being here and I'm sure it will be a great talk.
Thanks for asking me. And, I think that Balkan Pod is doing a really good job. It's filling a niche there. So, you're doing a good job. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for these compliments. I'm really happy to hear this from you. Dear Judah, Balkan country, face really catastrophic depopulation. So you wrote a series of articles on this subject. I'm going to ask you, which are the most depopulated countries in the Balkans and why these countries?
Well, okay, let me just run back a bit. Let me just explain how this project came about. You're correct that I've covered the Balkans for a long time. I write about them for The Economist. But then 3 years ago, I was invited to be a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. They have a project called Europe's Futures. And Ivan Vejvoda, who runs it, said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, a lot of people in the Balkans talk or mention this problem of population loss and the demographic problems that all Balkan countries are facing. And it struck me that when I started to look, I couldn't really find much solid information. I mean, people kind of mention things here and there, but and also I realized that some people knew a bit about their country, but they didn't really know how to put it in context. They knew a little bit maybe what was happening in Serbia, but they didn't know what was happening in Croatia or in Bosnia or in Kosovo or in Bulgaria or in Romania. So I realized that this is, I think, one of the single most important problems of the Balkans. And that's why I wanted to look at this issue. But, I want to stress here that, this is not a particular Balkan problem. This is a problem of, first of all, in Europe, but it's a problem across much of the world, in fact. I mean, you and some of your listeners may be aware recently that there's been quite a lot of controversy about what's happening in China, which is, after all, the most populated country on the planet, and where very recently they started saying that they were going to relax the laws on how many children people could have. And having recently in the last few years, allowed people to have 2 children, they're now saying, oh, please have 3 children. Why? Because the Chinese population is beginning to age. And if it hasn't already, very soon it will start to shrink. The fact is, though, that if we're coming now back to Europe, everywhere, populations are aging. That's the same in Portugal, it's the same in Italy, it's the same in Bulgaria, it's the same in Russia. But if you look at a map of Europe and you put down, you put kind of percentages of where populations are shrinking and where they're growing, it's very clear that what's happening is that populations of mostly former communist countries in Eastern Europe are shrinking, while populations in the west of Europe, or Central and Western Europe, tend to be either stable or growing. If you look at the fertility rates, they're not necessarily that much different. So what's happening is, the fact is that people from former communist countries, the poorer half of Europe, are not having children, or not having enough children, just like people in the west of Europe. But the fact is that they're also emigrating, and that's why populations are shrinking. Let me just give you a few examples here. Here are some figures of the change from 1989-90, so the period of the end of communism, until last year. Bosnia underwent a terrible war, of course. But Bosnia's population has shrunk by a quarter in that period. Serbia's population has shrunk by 8.7%, Croatia's by by just over 15%, Albania's by 12%, Romania's by 17%, Bulgaria's by 21%, and Moldova by 32%, so almost a third. But if you kind of look forward and on current projections, things could change. It's really, really dramatic. If you compare what the population is expected to be in 2050 compared to how it was, in 1989-90, Bosnia will have lost 37% of its population, if not more. Serbia, 23%. Kosovo, 11%, Croatia, 24%, Albania, more than 25%, Romania, 30%, Bulgaria, almost 40%, and Moldova, 45%, if not more. So on the one hand, you've got trends which are more or less the same everywhere. Then if you zoom into every country, the story is slightly different in every country, but the trends are the same. And if we look specifically at the Balkans, and then I'd like to say a couple of important points here. There's not that much difference between being a member of the EU and not being a member of the EU. In the past, in a way, it was a kind of almost a disadvantage when it came to this demographic issue, because when you joined the EU, at that point, you saw a great kind of outflux of people and people who were abroad illegally, then kind of legalizing their status. Now that's not so important because the Germans need people, they need people to work. It's become, for example, much easier to get work permits to go legally to Germany, or, for example, to go to Croatia, for example. If you want to go and work in Croatia, it's become much easier because they simply can't get the workforce that they used to have. If you're a Serb, why go work in the summer in Croatia? Not very good conditions, when you can go and work in Germany for the whole year in good conditions. But, if you're coming from Kosovo or Albania, you're probably happy to go and get pretty well paid for their rates in Croatia. So in general, trends are the same, and countries are at different stages in this demographic decline, and the stories are different in every country. But that's the introduction about the Balkans and about what's happening. And as I say, it's not a specific Balkan country. It's particularly bad in the Balkans, but it's not a specifically Balkan problem.
I see. Dear team, you mentioned that the stories are different in every country for depopulation, issues. What do you mean about this? What are the stories behind this problem in Albania and in Serbia and in Bosnia?
What's very interesting is that how the point where countries start declining is very, very different. So until really the before the war in Kosovo, so until the 90s, for example, Kosovo Albanians were having lots and lots of children, and so the demographic growth of the Albanian population was clearly a factor in the issues in Kosovo. In Serbia, by contrast, already I don't remember the figure off the top of my head, but already in the 60s or 70s, the population didn't begin to decline, but the fertility rate really began to drop off really quite dramatically. So in that sense, that if you imagine a train going in one direction, when you're talking about the Western Balkans, you can imagine that Serbia is the country in the lead because it's got the oldest population and began declining really a long time ago. And you've got Kosovo at the end with the youngest population, following the same trends, but 2-3 decades behind where Serbia is. Then you have other issues about why things are different. In the former Yugoslavia, people already in the 60s were emigrating. They didn't think of it as emigration. I suppose it was the same exactly in Turkey in the 60s and 70s. People went as Gastarbeiters to Germany, to Austria, to Scandinavia, and then they always thought that they would come back. Then they had children, then they stayed. So that what that meant was that when the wars started in former Yugoslavia, people had family, they had kind of networks. It was kind of relatively easy to go and join family and join friends, and in countries where they had been emigrating already since the 60s. Now, with Albania, it was really quite different, of course, because Albania, where almost a third of the population, or a third of Albanian citizens now live abroad, more or less, it was really totally different because, of course, Albania under Enver Hoxha and communism was completely hermetically sealed off. There was kind of zero emigration from Albania. But Albania was in such a bad state at the end of communism and in the years after the collapse that huge numbers began emigrating straight away, and that trend hasn't stopped. Albania is much richer. I mean, much wealthier than it was 30 years ago, evidently, and other countries in the region as well. But they were already so far behind, and Western countries their economies haven't stopped growing. I don't know about this COVID year, maybe slightly different, but it's you're in terms of earnings, financial welfare, and health systems and schools. It's always going to be better across the sea in Italy or in Germany or in a more developed economy. That's one of the big changes from the past.
Actually, I would like to draw attention to your last sentences because, in this migration studies, some issues are mostly discussed. For example, some researchers say that the main reason for migration is the lack of democracy and institutionalization. For example, the people from the Middle East are mostly immigrated because of these problems. Others say it's for economic reason. What is your opinion about the case of the Balkans? I mean, what kinds of problem affected demography in the region mostly?
The thing that affected demography in the Balkans, in the main, let's leave out kind of wars and conflict, etc. Just leave that out for the moment. The main thing that affects demography in the Balkans is the same thing that has affected demography in every other country in the world, and that is basically education of women and urbanization. Probably your grandmother or great-grandmother had 7 kids. That's the same in the Balkans or in other countries in Europe. 60, 70 years ago, people had big families. Now they don't. Why? Because people don't live in villages. They live in cities mostly. They live in flats. They don't have space for 7 children. They don't want to have 7 children because they think that 5 of them won't survive. They don't need children to go and kind of to help them on the farm. And women are educated. They want to have their careers, and they don't want to be tied down with 7 children. That's the same in Croatia, in Montenegro, in Turkey, in Britain, in the US, in Russia. That's the same everywhere in the world. It's the same in China. It's the same thing. Now, the question about emigration, why do people emigrate? With everybody who goes, there's a kind of different motivation, but it's like a cake. It's like the lack of democracy, lack of rule of law, lack of functional system can be part of it. But the economy is probably for most people always going to be slightly better. But if you, I'm not talking you personally, but I mean if one is has a family, young family, with small kids, education is going to be a factor. And if you live in a place where the schools are not very good, or you don't have the right contacts to get them into good schools, or healthcare is not very good, those are things which are going to count as well. I don't know there's much particular evidence that kind of lack of democracy as such is such a big factor. I mean, rule of law is something. I mean, I have a friend from Serbia who, one of the reasons that she decided to leave, in fact, it was the last straw as far as she was concerned, was she bought an apartment being built off plan, and she got a mortgage. And then before she could move in, she discovered the developer had sold it twice. Somebody else had moved in, and now she's paying a mortgage for a flat that she hasn't got. And she knows that the developer can pay judges or whatever, and maybe she's going to lose all that money, and it would take years and years and years to sort out. That's a factor for her. But there, in everybody's case, as has always been the case in history, there's always a kind of a mixture of reasons why people go.
I see. Thank you very much for this answer. And also you wrote in your articles, and demography and immigration are leading to labor shortages in the Balkans. So the quality of the workforce is declining day by day in the region. So how will this country develop, and how this country will catch up with EU standards if their population is reducing. So do you have any idea about this? Maybe I can ask, is it possible to solve this problem?
Let's take the first bit first. How countries in the western half of Europe solving it? They're solving it through immigration. At the moment, there aren't that many people who want to immigrate to Balkan countries. But with labor shortages, then, wages go up. When wages go up, then less people are going to go, but you also might start to get some immigration. So let's take Bulgaria, which is in the EU, but has had a huge amount of immigration over the last 20, 30 years. Actually, now, the fact is that the net immigration rate is much, 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 much smaller than ever before. In other words, it's kind of stabilized. Wages have gone up, conditions have gone up. Yes, of course, it's a kind of corrupt country. It's not that rich, it's not that wealthy, but, it's not at all the same country that it was 10 years ago. So what does that mean? It means that some people who, first of all, sorry, and one thing that I should add is that emigration doesn't necessarily mean forever. And especially today, what we have now, which we didn't have really 30 years ago, is much, much, much more circular migration. So people coming and going all the time. So sometimes these emigration figures, people kind of estimate and they go, 100,000 people have left the country and what a disaster. But what they often don't take into account is that 100,000 people may have left, but, you may have had 90,000 people coming back. So you've got a net loss of 10, which is bad, but it's not as bad as losing 100,000. So actually, you've got a lot of movement of people coming and going. So now in Bulgaria, things have kind of stabilized. There's much less people leaving. There's people are discovering, people who, for example, may have been kitchen fitters or bathroom fitters in Scandinavia. They've come back because of COVID, or they've come back in the last few years, and then they're discovering there's a lot of demand because of construction in the country for the stuff that they do. They may not be able to charge as much as they do in Oslo or Stockholm, but on the other hand, their expenses are a lot cheaper as well. Their outgoings. So, there's that element. And then you start to get some immigration. There's beginning to be some immigration even into Bulgaria. And last week I was in Albania, and for the first time, people are talking about, very small amount, but, there even is some, immigration of kind of unusual places, things that you would think are quite unusual, like fishermen from Egypt, because for fishing, fishing boats can't get enough people because they've gone. So they're employing Egyptians, and Egyptians can get more money in Albania than they can in Egypt. There are agencies beginning to bring a very few people in, even in Albania. So even in Albania, there is some immigration starting. So, that's one element. The second thing is that actually there is something also happening, or two things are happening, is that in certain sectors where you don't necessarily have to be somewhere else to do the job, for example, in IT, actually, you could be as well off or better off in Belgrade, for example, than in California, because you don't physically need to be in California to be a kind of programmer or do a lot of stuff in IT, and your expenses are much less. So even if you're paid a bit less, but it's a very competitive industry, even if you're paid a bit less, your standard of living could be higher. So some sectors are not losing as much as population or as much as you'd think. And also, in a year or two, we'll see what effect COVID's had, because you've had a lot of people who went back because of COVID, then they may have gone abroad again, but, maybe not all. I did some work on Bulgaria, and we found that quite a lot of educated Bulgarians who could work remotely went back to Bulgaria and think, I could stay here. I could do this job, from Bulgaria. I don't necessarily need to be in expensive London or expensive Frankfurt. And if my company is willing to pay me and willing to let me stay working abroad, well, I'd rather be at home with my friends and family and, live at home. So there are certain things that are happening. But, overall, the big question about how can you reverse these trends, and especially when it comes to fertility, is very difficult. I mean, there are two countries in the eastern half of Europe or Central and Eastern Europe, which have really pushed a lot of money into this. Poland has done this, and Hungary has done it. And they put really, in Hungary, they've put up to 5% of GDP, giving tax advantages and all sorts of things to encourage people to have children.
What kinds of means the government used to reverse this?
Okay, let me talk about Poland and Hungary, because in Balkan countries, they give a little bit of money if you have kids, but they don't have enough money to do anything. But the evidence suggests that where you do have money, that it doesn't really seem to work. So in Poland, they have something called a program called 500 plus. And basically you get a certain amount of money for every child that you get. And you get a kind of this allowance every month until children are 18. And it's not producing more children. But what it's doing is it's a valuable social transfer. People at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale find it great. It actually also has the unintended consequence of taking some women out of the workforce, because some women think, actually, I've got this extra money coming in now. I don't need to work. Because now I can look after my children. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're having more children. In Hungary had one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe. Now it's better. And the Hungarian government says, our fertility rate has gone up more than any other country in Europe. That's true. It has gone up quite a lot. But actually, the number of children being born in Hungary is pretty stable. The number of people dying is, because it's quite old, it grows. And so the population is still shrinking. But it's quite possible that what they've done in Hungary is that they put money into, they give you sort of tax advantages. There's they give you kind of help to buy a bigger car, help to buy or build a bigger property so you can have more children. The evidence is it might have stabilized things in Hungary a bit, but it's just not producing, lots of kids. And the fact is that no one's found really the answer to sort of how to turn this problem around.
I see. Thank you very much, dear Team Judah. We are about to close this Balkan Pod episode. Really, thank you for spending time with me. I would like to meet you face to face as soon as possible.
That would be very nice. Well, congratulations, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. Dear listeners, see you next week, same day and same time.